أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of the life of Prophet Muhammad. In our last episode, we spoke about Umratul Qadha, which is the Umrah that the Prophet made up after signing the Treaty of Hudaybiyya. In this episode, we want to give an introduction to the next major battle that occurs. And this is a battle that occurs before the conquest of Mecca. And this is the Battle of Mu'tah. Now, before we delve into the details of the battle itself, there are some preliminary details that can help us gain some context. Now, when we speak about the Battle of Mu'tah, of course, Mu'tah is a reference to a place, just like the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud. These are all references to geographical locations. Now, in terms of the location of Mu'tah, of course, the Battle of Mu'tah takes place in the 8th year after the Hijrah. So this is a few months before the actual conquest of Mecca. And Mu'tah is a town located in the southern part of modern-day Jordan. It's about, if you look at the map, it's about 30 kilometers southwest of the city of Karak. And this is where the historical Battle of Mu'tah took place. Now, there's a discussion among Arbabu Siyar, and by Arbabu Siyar, I mean the scholars who specialize in the biography of the Prophet. There's a technical discussion among the scholars of the Sirah with respect to what do we call Mu'tah? Was it a Ghazwa? Was it a Sariyah? Now, as we mentioned in our previous episodes, this is a terminology that we find in the books of Sirah. As we've mentioned, a Sariyah is a reference to a military expedition that was not led by the Prophet. So these are the military expeditions where someone is appointed by the Prophet, whereas a Ghazwa is a military expedition where the Prophet ﷺ is acting as the commander and the general of the army. Now, the Prophet ﷺ was not physically present in the Battle of Mu'tah, so technically it is a Sariyah because it was actually led by 3 companions of the Prophet, whom we'll speak about inshallah shortly. Now, sometimes it's referred to as a Ghazwa simply because of the great number of companions that participated in this battle. So if we go back, for example, to the Battle of Badr, you have a little over 300 companions of the Prophet. If you look at the Battle of Uhud, for instance, you have, upwards of, about 1,000 companions participating in the Battle of Uhud. With the Battle of Mu'tah, the historical accounts indicate that there were about 3,000 companions of the Prophet who were sent to Mu'tah to participate in this battle. So because this is not an ordinary military expedition, and it rivals the major battles of Islam in terms of the number of participants, some scholars of the Sirah, they basically refer to it as a Ghazwa. But this is a technical discussion that doesn't really have much importance. Now, why is the Battle of Mu'tah so significant in the prophetic biography? For a number of reasons. Number one, this is the first Muslim battle that takes place outside of the Arabian Peninsula. It happens in the territory of modern-day Jordan. So in terms of geography, it's much further than where the battles of Islam are taking place. It's taking place near the border of the Roman Empire. The Battle of Mu'tah is also significant because of the the martyrs of Mu'tah, some of the most prominent and elite companions of the Prophet ﷺ were tragically martyred in the Battle of Mu'tah. So Rasulullah ﷺ, he loses companions of the highest eminence who, one could say that these are people who are really irreplaceable in terms of, how great they were in the Muslim community. And the three main shuhada of Mu'tah are Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and we'll speak about him inshallah shortly. And this is, of course, the elder brother of Ali ibn Abi Talib. He was the leader of the Muslim diaspora in Abyssinia, a man who was so influential that he played a role in the conversion of Najashi. And then you have Zayd ibn Haritha, who was the adopted son of the Prophet, who was so beloved to the Prophet, and whom the Prophet loved as though he was his own son. And in fact, oftentimes Zayd ibn Haritha would be referred to as Zayd ibn Muhammad because of how beloved he was to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Zayd ibn Haritha was martyred in the Battle of Mu'tah. And then you have the great Sahabi, the warrior poet, as he is called, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, also fell in this battle. So some very prominent and elite Sahaba were tragically killed in this battle. And the land of Mu'tah today is actually a place that is considered a mazar, meaning Muslims from different denominations and different sects, they visit the mausoleums of these great martyrs. And this is, an important point to mention here, is that visiting shrines and mausoleums is not something that is exclusive to Shia Muslims. Visiting the qubur, visiting the graves of the great personalities of Islam was a mainstream Islamic practice. Sunni Muslims used to go and pay their respects at these holy sites. They would visit the companions of the Prophet. They would send salam to them. They would salute them. But unfortunately, in the past, several decades, we see the rise of Wahhabism and a very extreme form of Salafism, which basically has labeled this practice as a deviant practice, and some go as far as accusing Muslims of committing shirk simply because they're visiting and they're paying their respects to these great figures in Islamic history. Now, in any case, when we look at the Battle of Mu'tah, one, of course, is naturally going to ask, what was the purpose of the battle? What caused and what triggered this military conflict? Now, when you look at the sources that we have, the great Muslim historian Al-Waqidi, who died in 207 after the Hijrah, so this is definitely one of the earliest sources on the Seerah. Al-Waqidi basically reports that the Prophet ﷺ, he sent an army to Mu'tah, to the Syrian frontier near the Roman border. And this was basically a response to the murder of one of Rasulullah ﷺ's emissaries. So this emissary was killed by one of the leaders of the Ghassanid tribe. And this man's name is Shurahbil ibn Amr. And the Prophet ﷺ, he sends a man by the name of Al-Harith ibn Umayr al-Azdi to deliver a message to the ruler of Busra, which is basically an area that is technically under the jurisdiction of the Roman Empire. And this emissary of the Prophet was killed. And to kill an ambassador, to kill an emissary, even in modern times, is considered to be a declaration of war. It's something that was well known in the ancient world, the pre-modern world, in modern times, that you never kill an ambassador. You never take the life of an emissary. If you do, it's seen as an escalation and it's seen as a declaration of war. So Al-Waqidi basically says that the Battle of Mu'tah was a response to the assassination of the Prophet's emissary to the town of Busra, and the Prophet was basically wanted to send a letter, perhaps inviting the Romans into the fold of Islam. However, Al-Harith ibn Umayr al-Azdi is killed. Now, after the Prophet's ambassador is basically murdered in cold blood, Al-Waqidi basically continues and he says, وَبَلَغَ خَبَرُهُ إِلَىٰ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ فَاشْتَدَّ عَلَيْهِ ذَلِكَ. The news of the assassination of Al-Harith ibn Umayr al-Azdi, it reaches the Prophet, and the Prophet was greatly distressed by this news. He was angered by this. وَنَدَبَ النَّاسِ فَأَخْبَرَهُمْ الْخَبَرِ. The Prophet ﷺ, he informed the Muslim community about what had transpired, about the tragic death of Al-Harith. And then Al-Waqidi says, وَكَأَنَّهُ طَلَبَ إِلَيْهِمْ أَن يَخْرُجُوا إِلَى مُعَسْكَرِهِمْ. Al-Waqidi here says, the Prophet indicated to them, and it was as though he was requesting his companions to mobilize and to form an army and advance toward the Syrian frontier. Now, at this point, the Prophet ﷺ was exhorting his companions to prepare for battle. But up until now, the Prophet ﷺ had not appointed a military leader. He hadn't appointed someone to lead this battle. Now, as I mentioned, there are 3,000 companions that come forward and volunteer. Now, of course, this doesn't represent the whole of Medina, but a sizable number of companions, they come forward, they volunteer to go to battle and to advance towards the Syrian frontier. So you have 3,000 companions who step up to the plate. Now, because of the Treaty of Hudaybiyya, the Prophet ﷺ felt more comfortable sending out that many men. Typically in the pre-Hudaybiyya period, we see the Prophet ﷺ was always very wary of leaving Medina unmanned, because this would make the Muslims vulnerable to attack from the neighboring nomadic tribes and from Quraysh. But because the Treaty of Hudaybiyya guaranteed peace and safety, the Prophet ﷺ felt that it was appropriate to allow that many soldiers to empty out of Medina and advance towards the Roman border. Now, what we see from the narrations, we have a narration that speaks about the individuals whom the Prophet appoints as the military leaders of Mu'tah. ففي رواية أبان ibn Uthman al-Ahmar, one of the contemporaries of Imam al-Sadiq, Aban ibn Uthman al-Ahmar, who was a companion of the Prophet, who was someone who was very interested in the history of Islam, he reports a narration from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, where Imam al-Sadiq says, أنه صلى الله عليه وآله استعمل عليهم جعفر بن أبي طالب فإن قتل فزيد بن الحارثة فإن قتل فعبد الله بن رواحة. It's very interesting here that Imam al-Sadiq says that the Prophet ﷺ appointed 3 commanders, and it just shows you how important this battle is. The Prophet wanted there to be someone in charge because of what was at stake, because of the number of men who are participating. This was a very serious battle. So the Prophet appoints 3 commanders. The first commander is Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. And the Prophet, and the Imam al-Sadiq says that the Prophet tells the Muslims, he tells his companions that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is the first commander. If Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is killed in battle, the one who takes his place as commander is Zayd ibn Haritha. And if Zayd ibn Haritha is killed, then the companion who steps forward and replaces him as military commander and general is Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Now, why is this significant? Because when you look at the Sunni sources agree that Abdullah ibn Rawaha is the third commander. He's the third in line. But there's a difference in the order of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib and Zayd ibn Haritha. In Sunni sources, the Prophet allegedly says Zayd ibn Haritha is the first commander. If Zayd ibn Haritha is killed, then Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is second in command. And if Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is killed, and then you have Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Imam al-Sadiq says no. The one who was the first commander was Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. And then Zayd ibn Haritha, and then after him is Abdullah ibn Rawaha. And this is noteworthy because, again, this order is based on the narration of Imam al-Sadiq. And also, if you look at the poetry of Hassan ibn Thabit, who was one of the great poets among the companions of the Prophet, he explicitly mentions Ja'far ibn Abi Talib being the first commander. Now, this is an example of how individuals and how historians throughout history essentially discriminate against the Alawis, against the Hashemites, where others are they're always put ahead of them. So here is a small example about how sometimes individuals in the history of Islam, they try to give the family of Abu Talib and the Bani Hashim, they try to diminish their position by saying that there were others who were ahead of them. But when you look at the narration of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam and the poetry of Hassan ibn Thabit, they all point to the fact that Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was the first commander of the army. Now, again, going back to the narration that I mentioned, the narration then says, if Abdullah ibn Rawaha is killed, فَإِنْ قُتِلْ فَعَبْدُ ibn Rawaha فَإِنْ أُصِيبَ Abdullah ibn Rawaha فَلْيَرْتَضِ الْمُسْلِمُونَ بَيْنَهُمْ رَجُلًا فَلْيَجْعَلُوهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. The Prophet says, if Abdullah ibn Rawaha is martyred, then the Muslims from among themselves, they should select someone to lead them. And of course, the narration continues saying, وَعَقَدَ لَهُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ لِوَاءً أَبْيَضٍ. The Prophet ﷺ, he gave his army a white flag. Now, of course, in the Western context, a white flag signals surrender, but of course, this is not the case. This was just the color of the flag that the Muslims were carrying as they were going towards the Battle of Mu'tah. وَهُمْ ثَلَاثَةُ آلَافٍ. So this narration again mentions that the number of Sahaba that participated in this expedition were 3,000. So again, a very significant number. The narrations also mention, and this is mentioned in multiple sources, in Sunni and Shia Hadith sources, فَلَمَّا أَجْمَعُوا الْمَسِيرِ. When the companions had decided and they were advancing towards Mu'tah, مَشَى النَّاسُ إِلَيْهِمْ يُوَدِّعُونَهُم. The people of Medina, they were walking with the Muslim army and they were farewelling one another, and the soldiers were farewelling their families, because again, it's very possible that many of these men would be killed in battle. So you can imagine how emotional it was for the wives and the children and the elders, seeing their men and farewelling them as they exit Medina. وَخَطَبَهُمْ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. Before the army departs Medina, the narrations mention 2 sermons that the Prophet delivers to the army. And this is important. And the narrations actually mention the khutbah, the sermon that the Prophet gave to the Muslims. So the first sermon that he gives as they're preparing to leave Medina and travel towards the Syrian frontier, he says to his companions, "Usikum bitaqwa Allah." It's very important here to note that in Islam, military conflict is not just a matter of acquiring material goods or expanding the empire of the Muslims. It's not just about the acquisition of land and the acquisition of spoils. The Prophet ﷺ, as they're preparing for battle, as they're preparing to go towards the battle, the Prophet reminds them to be God conscious. Because jihad is not just war. Jihad is an ibadah. Even if you look at the books on Islamic law, jihad is considered to be part of the chapters on al-ibadat. Meaning, a person is only rewarded for fighting on the battlefield if they are doing it with the intention of seeking nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, the primary motivator should be nothing other than to attain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If someone joins the Prophet in battle and they're doing it for the sake of acquiring spoils or to be praised and held in high regard by their peers, this action is not accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, they would be committing a sin, because jihad is considered an act of worship. So hence the Prophet begins by addressing them with this instruction of being God conscious. أُوصِيكُم بِتَقْوَى اللَّهِ وَبِمَنْ مَعَكُم مِّنَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ خَيْرًا. The Prophet is addressing 3,000 of his companions, and he says to them, in addition to taqwa, being God conscious, you should treat your fellow Muslims who are standing side by side with you in battle, treat them well. Be kind to each other. You are brothers in faith. Look after one another. And then the Prophet says, اغزوهم بسم الله في سبيل الله. Depart in the name of God and on the path of God. Meaning, go forward at every phase of this military expedition. Be conscious of God. Do everything for the sake of God, and not for the sake of your egos, and not for the sake of any materialistic gain. And then the Prophet says, قاتلوا من كفر بالله. Fight whoever denies God, whoever stubbornly rejects God. اغزوا ولا تغلوا ولا تغدروا. The Prophet says, fight those who deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but do not break treaties, do not be treacherous, do not break promises. وَلَا تُمَثِّلُوا. And when you fight, do not mutilate the bodies of your enemies. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا وَلِيدًا. Don't kill children. Right? So the Prophet is setting important rules of combat. That just because this is a battle, it doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. There are red lines that have to be observed. Allah has set red lines that you cannot cross, that you cannot transgress. You have to still be honorable, even when you are fighting in the battlefields. وَإِذَا لَقِيتَ عَدُوَّكَ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. And when you encounter your enemy, فَادْعُهُمْ إِلَى ثَلَاث خِصَالٍ. When you encounter your enemy, call them to one of the following. The Prophet is reminding the Muslims that when you encounter your enemy, don't straight away start fighting. No, invite them to one of three things. فَأَيَّتُهُنَّ مَا أَجَابُوكَ فَاقْبَلْ مِنْهُمْ وَكُفَّ عَنْهُمْ. If they accept any of the three offers that you make to them, then you should not fight them. So again, you see the Prophet ﷺ being a prophet, a messenger of God, who is always trying to find peaceful ways to resolve conflicts. The Prophet ﷺ, when it came to military conflict and fighting in the battlefields, it was always a last resort. The Prophet ﷺ always tried to use diplomatic means. And then the Prophet says to them, ثُمَّ ادْعُهُمْ إِلَى الْإِسْلَامِ. The first thing that you should say when you encounter your enemy is invite them to Islam. Invite them to Islam wholeheartedly and genuinely wish the best for them. invite them to Islam, introduce them to Islam. And of course, when you have the likes of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, when you have the likes of Zayd ibn Haritha and Abdullah ibn Rawaha, these are not just warriors. These are very, very learned companions of the Prophet who have completely imbibed the spirit of Islam. These are scholar warriors, warriors who are also scholars, very rare breeds. فَإِنْ أَجَابُوكَ فَاقْبَلْ مِنْهُمْ. If you invite them to Islam and they comply and they accept your invitation, then let them go. You have no right to be hostile towards them. ثُمَّ ادْعُهُمْ إِلَى التَّحَوُّلِ مِنْ دَارِهِمْ إِلَى دَارِ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ. If they accept Islam, invite them, call them to relocate and to reside in Dar al-Muhajirin, in the territory of the emigrants, meaning let them come to Medina, let us fortify our city, let us build our city as brothers and sisters in faith. وَأَخْبِرْهُمْ أَنَّهُمْ إِنْ فَعَلُوا ذَلِكَ فَلَهُمْ مَا لِلْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَعَلَيْهِمْ مَا عَلَى الْمُهَاجِرِينَ. If they become Muslim and they relocate and they settle in Medina, then they will share the benefits and the harms of the Muhajirin. Meaning that they will be treated the same way that the early converts of Islam are treated. What an honor that the Prophet ﷺ is not going to treat them like second-class citizens in his community. If you join Islam and you settle in Medina, you will be treated with the same reverence and respect as the early converts to Islam. فَإِنْ أَبَوْا. So this was the first invitation. The Prophet says, give them 3 offers. This was the first offer, invite them to Islam and have them relocate. فَإِنْ أَبَوْا. If they accept Islam, فَإِنْ أَبَوْا أَنْ يَتَحَوَّلُوا مِنْهَا فَأَخْبِرْهُمْ أَنَّهُمْ يَكُونُونَ كَأَعْرَابِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. If they accept Islam, but they insist on remaining in their homeland, and they don't have any desire to relocate and to move to Medina, then tell them that they are like the Muslim Arabs, and the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala apply to them. They are fully Muslim. وَلَا يَكُونُ لَهُمْ فِي الْغَنِيمَةِ وَالْفَيْءِ شَيْءٌ إِلَّا أَن يُجَاهِدُوا مَعَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. But they will not be given the shares of the spoils of war that the Muslims participate in unless they also join the Muslims. So they don't get the same perks, because all of those who are in Medina, they are recipients of khums, so they benefit from the spoils when Muslims go to battle. So they're fully Muslim, but they're deprived of the spoils that are acquired by the Muslims in battle. If they want to receive a portion of the spoils, they would have to participate with the Muslims when they go to battle. This is the second option. فَإِنْ أَبَوْا. If they refuse to become Muslim, فَإِنْهُمْ أَبَوْا فَاسْأَلْهُمُ الْجِزْيَةِ. If they refuse to become Muslim, then call them to pay jizya, which is a special tax that is levied against non-Muslims from Ahlul Kitab. Jizya is only taken from Ahlul Kitab, meaning jizya is not offered to mushrikeen, idol worshippers. It's only offered to Ahlul Kitab. So since the Prophet is sending his army towards the Romans are Christians, so they have the option of remaining upon their monotheistic tradition. Whereas if the Prophet ﷺ was fighting against the mushrikeen, the idol worshippers, they would not be given this option of jizya. It's either you become Muslim or, we settle this conflict in the battlefield. Jizya is a third option that is afforded to Ahlul Kitab. فَإِنْهُمْ أَجَابُوكَ. If they accept to pay jizya, this tax to the Muslim state, the government of the Prophet, then accept it and don't fight them. فَاقْبَلْ مِنْهُمْ وَكُفَّ عَنْهُمْ. فَإِنْهُمْ أَبَوْا. But if they refuse to become Muslim and they refuse to pay jizya, فَاسْتَعِنْ بِاللَّهِ وَقَاتِلْهُمْ. But if they do not comply with this, then ask Allah for His help and fight them. You have my green light to engage in battle with them. And then the Prophet says, وَإِذَا حَاصَرْتَ أَهْلَ حِصْنٍ فَأَرَادُوكَ أَن تَجْعَلَ لَهُمْ ذِمَّةَ اللَّهِ وَذِمَّةَ نَبِيِّهِ فَلَا تَجْعَلْ لَهُمْ ذِمَّةَ اللَّهِ وَذِمَّةَ نَبِيِّهِ. And if you, the Prophet is saying to his companions, and if you besieged people of a fort or a city, and they asked you to put them under the protection of God and the Prophet, then reject their request. Why? وَلَكِنْ اجْعَلْ لَهُمْ ذِمَّتَكَ وَذِمَّةَ أَصْحَابِكَ فَإِنَّكُمْ أن تخفروا ذممكم وذمة أصحابكم أهون من أن تخفروا ذمة الله وذمة نبيه. So the Prophet says, if you besieged people of a fort or a city and they ask you to put them under the protection of God and the Prophet, then reject their request. Instead, put them under the protection of your own and your companions, since if they violate the protection of your treaty and the treaty of your companions, that would be better than violating that of God and His Messenger. So the Prophet is basically saying that because it's possible for these people to renege on their treaty, offer them your protection. Do not offer them the protection of God and His Messenger, because it would be a greater sin for them to violate a treaty that is officially offered to them by Allah and His Messenger than to violate a treaty that is offered by the companions themselves. وَخَرَجَ النَّبِيُّ. Again, the narration continues. وَخَرَجَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وآله مُشَيْعًا. So this is the end of the first sermon that the Prophet gives to his men. وَخَرَجَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وآله مُشَيِّعًا لِأَهْلِ مُؤْتَةٍ. So the narration says that the Prophet, he escorted the men, the soldiers who were going for the battle of Mu'tah. The Prophet, again, showing them great respect and honor. He walks with them to farewell them. حتى بلغ ثنية الوداع. ثنية الوداع is basically the northwest entrance point of Medina. For those of you who, if you look at the map of Medina, Medina is covered by lava rock from the east, west, and the south. And the only way to enter or to exit Medina is from the northwest corner. And in that region you have two hills, because Thaniya comes from the word Ithnain, which means two. So because you have these two hills, this was the place where the residents of Medina would receive people who would arrive, or they would farewell those who are departing. فَوَقَفَ. So 3,000 of the companions, they're there at Thaniyatul Wada', the place where the residents would farewell their loved ones. وَقَفُوا حَوْلَ. So the companions are standing around the Prophet and they're about to now exit Medina. The Prophet gives them a second short sermon. فَقَالَ لَهُمْ صلى الله عليه وآله اغزوهم بسم الله. Again, the Prophet is trying to purify the intentions of the Sahaba, that depart in the name of Allah. Right? اغزوا بسم الله فقاتلوا عدو الله وعدوكم بالشام. Depart in the name of God. Again, reminding them of Allah, ensuring that they're God conscious, and fight the enemy of God and your enemy in Syria, meaning the Syrian frontier. And then the Prophet again highlighting rules of engagement when it comes to military conflict. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, it is reported that he says, وَسَتَجِدُونَ فِيهَا رِجَالًا مُعْتَزِلِينَ لِلنَّاسِ فِي الصَّوَامِعِ. The Prophet says, when you go to the Syrian frontier, you will see people who worship God in their monasteries. You'll see monks, for example, because it's part of the Roman Empire. You'll see monks in their monasteries. Rasulullah says, do not encroach upon them. Do not attack their scholars. Do not attack those who are worshipping in their monasteries. وستجدون آخرين في رؤوسهم للشيطان مفاحص. And you will see people whose heads are Satan's nests. It seems the Prophet might be describing helmets of those who have come to fight. The Prophet says those who are armed, and it's very clear that they've come to fight you, then you have my permission to decapitate them, to fight them in battle. فَقْلَعُوهَا بِالسُّيُوفِ. You can strike their helmets with your swords. And then the Prophet ﷺ, what does he say? He tells his men, never kill women. وَلَا تَقْتُلُنَّ امْرَأَةً وَلَا صَغِيرًا مُرْضِعًا وَلَا كَبِيرًا فَانِيًا. Do not kill women. Even if women use abusive language with you, even if they curse you and they taunt you, do not kill women. Do not kill children. Do not kill elderly people. If you see an old man, don't say that, okay, we can attack him because he's one of the enemies. If it's an elderly person who's not involved in the battle, you leave them alone. You do not harm them. And then the Prophet says, and never set palm groves to fire. Don't destroy the vegetative life. Right? Don't cut down trees. وَلَا تَهْدِمُوا بَيْتًا. And do not destroy houses. Right? The Prophet ﷺ is telling his men that we're not a force of destruction. We are trying to eradicate oppression. We don't want to be a force of corruption. We want to be a force of reformation, a force of liberation. So do not destroy the vegetation, do not cut down trees, do not destroy homes, and so on. So the Prophet concludes his sermon. There's a very beautiful conversation here between Abdullah ibn Rawaha and the Prophet. Now again, Abdullah ibn Rawaha is the third military commander that has been appointed by the Prophet. So again, this brigade of 3,000 soldiers is being led by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. He's the first commander. As long as he's alive, he's the leader of the army. If Ja'far ibn Abi Talib is killed, Zayd ibn Haritha takes charge. And if Zayd ibn Haritha is killed, Abdullah ibn Rawaha. So again, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, among the companions, he's one of the greatest companions of the Prophet. And again, this is very important for us to emphasize because there is a misconception in the minds of many that the Shi'a have malice and animosity towards the companions of the Prophet. This is not true. The Shi'a hold the companions of the Prophet who were obedient to the Prophet, especially those who laid their lives down for Islam during the life of the Prophet. We hold them in the highest regard. An example is Abdullah ibn Rawaha, Zayd ibn Haritha, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. The Shi'a salute these Sahaba. In fact, we seek nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the intercession of such personalities. So the narration says, وَلَمَّا وَدَّعَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ ibn Rawaha قَالَ لَهُ. So Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he asks the Prophet for some advice. وَلَمَّا وَدَّعَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ ibn Rawaha قال له يا رسول الله مرني بشيء أحفظه عنك. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he says, Ya Rasulullah, give me some advice that I can remember and I can preserve. فقال له صلى الله عليه وآله إنك قادم غدا بلدا السجود به قليل فأكثر السجود. What a beautiful piece of advice the Prophet gives. Rasulullah tells Abdullah ibn Rawaha, again, this is powerful because it's in the context of battle and war. The Prophet says, you will soon enter a land where prostration to God is something very rare. Very few people prostrate to God. So what should you do? So try to perform sujood as much as possible. And then the Prophet stopped. He did not say anything. فَقَالَ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ زِدْنِي يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. So Abdullah asks the Prophet for more advice. So the Prophet ﷺ, he says, اذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ فَإِنَّهُ عَوْنٌ لَكَ عَلَى مَا تَطْلُبُ. The Prophet says, remember Allah all the time, because He is the one who will help you attain what you want to achieve. Have your greatest hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فانطلق ابن رواحة ذاهبا ثم رجع إليه. So Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he left after the Prophet gave him two pieces of advice. The first was, you're going to a land where sujood is very rare, so increase your sujood. And be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seek His help, because He's the one who will help you attain what you want to attain. He leaves and then he comes back to the Prophet. And he says, Ya Rasulullah, Inna Allah witrun yuhibbul witr. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he says, God is odd, meaning that God is one, an odd number, and He loves the odd numbers. So Abdullah ibn Rawaha is basically saying, Ya Rasulullah, you gave me two pieces of advice, and this is an even number. Give me one more piece of advice. Make it three so it becomes an odd number. Right? So, I mean, even if you look at some of our adhkar, you see that, for example, the third, fourth rak'ah, Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar, you do it once or three times. This is what's mustahab. Takbiratul ihram, do it once, which is an odd number, or 7 times, which is also mustahab. So you see these odd numbers even in some of our ritual worship. So the third piece of advice that the Prophet gives to Abdullah ibn Rawaha is, Ya ibn Rawaha, ما عجزت فلا تعجزن إن أسأت عشرا أن تحسن واحدة. O son of Rawaha, if you fail to do anything, do not fail to do at least one good deed in case you have done 10 bad deeds. Meaning, the Prophet is saying that if you happen to commit 10 sins, you make 10 mistakes, then at least make up for those mistakes by doing one good deed. Because one of the most powerful effects of good deeds is that they eradicate sins. One of the ways in which we attain the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to do hasanat, do good deeds. Al-hasanat yudhibna sayyi'at. Because the good deeds, they repel, they remove the evil actions. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, when he receives this advice from the Prophet, he says, لا أسألك عن شيء بعدها. That I'm not going to ask you for any more advice. Meaning, it's as though Abdullah ibn Rawaha is saying to the Prophet that what you have given me in terms of spiritual insight and advice is sufficient. وَمَضَى ذَاهِبًا. And Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he goes on his way. So as I've mentioned, this is one of the unique battles of Islam where the Prophet is very careful and he's very concerned about there being leadership in this battle. He appoints 3 commanders, one after the other: Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Zayd ibn Haritha, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Now it is reported that the men, they approach the Syrian border. So now they're traveling towards this region, and they receive some very distressing news. They receive word that the Romans have assembled an army of 10,000 men. Now, there's a lot of discrepancy about the number, the figures, the number of fighters in Mu'tah on the side of the Romans. I've seen some narrations that put the numbers at 100,000. Now, the point is that the Muslims discover that the Romans have a huge army. The Muslims are outnumbered. So, according to a narration that we have from Aban ibn Uthman's book, in Aban ibn Uthman's book, the Muslims learned about the huge number of their enemies, and you have kind of a coalition, an alliance of different tribes joining. So you have many Christian tribes joining the Romans because they have a shared religious tradition. The enemy moved to the area of Musharif under the commandership of a person called Malik ibn Zafila. So he was the commander of this Roman brigade that consisted of these tribes. فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ ذَلِكَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ أَقَامُوا فِي مَعَانٍ. When the Muslims learned about where their enemy was camping, they resided in Ma'an. Again, so these are different villages near the Syrian frontier. So the Muslims settle in this area for 2 nights. Now what are they doing? يُفَكِّرُونَ فِي أَمْرِهِمْ. They're trying to strategize about what to do because they had not anticipated that they would be that severely outnumbered. They would be outnumbered by that much. So some of them, they were speaking amongst each other and they said, some of them suggested, نَكْتُبُ إِلَىٰ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ فَنُخْبِرَهُ بِعَدَدِ عَدُوِّنَا. So some of the Sahaba, they suggested that we should write a letter to the Prophet informing him about how much our enemies are. We should tell the Prophet that, Ya Rasulullah, the Romans are much greater in number than we anticipated. فَإِمَّا أَنْ يَمُدَّنَا بِالرِّجَالِ. So either, when the Prophet discovered this, either he's going to send us reinforcements, وَإِمَّا أَنْ يَأْمُرَنَا بِأَمْرِهِ فَنَمْضِلَ. Or he'll give us some other instruction and we'll follow the instruction of the Prophet. So you sense hesitation in the ranks of the Muslims. Many of them are genuinely afraid, right? When you have, odds that are, basically 4-1 almost, many of them feel like this is a suicide mission. The narrations say, فَشَجَّعَ النَّاسَ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ ibn Rawaha. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he stands up and he addresses the companions of the Prophet. فَقَالَ وَاللَّهِ إِنَّ الَّتِي تَكْرَهُونَ لَلَّذِي خَرَجْتُمْ تَطْلُبُونَ. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he says to the companions of the Prophet, he says that I swear to Allah that what you dislike, right, because all of them are hesitant because they are afraid of death. Abdullah ibn Rawaha is saying that I swear by Allah that what you dislike is what you have departed for and what you are seeking, meaning that the reason why we're coming out here is that we want to attain shahada. And then he says, وَمَا نُقَاتِلِ النَّاسِ بِالْعَدَدِ. When we fight, he says to them, we're not relying on our numbers. وَلَا قُوَّةً وَلَا كَثْرَةً. We're not relying on our numbers or our weapons or our armaments. Because if you look at the battle of Badr, we were also outnumbered, but Allah gave us victory. We won the battle of Badr because of Allah's help, not because we had numbers or we had weapons. So Abdullah ibn Rawaha is basically telling the Sahaba that what's wrong with you guys? What has changed? Don't you remember the early days of Islam? Don't you remember those early battles? Why don't you have the same resolve? The Lord who helped us in Badr against our enemies, even though they were 3 times our size, is the same Lord that will support us and help us in this battle. And then he says, مَا نُقَاتِلُهُمْ إِلَّا بِهَذَا الدِّينِ. Our real strength is our iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الَّذِي أَكْرَمَنَا اللَّهُ بِهِ. Allah has given us the greatest honor, and that is the honor of faith, the honor of His religion. فَانْطَلِقُوا. Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he says, let's keep on going. I don't care about how many soldiers the Romans have. Let's go, let's advance, let's keep on moving. فَإِنَّمَا هِيَ إِحْدَى الْحُسْنَيَيْنِ. Because we are moving towards two possible excellent outcomes. إِمَّا ظُهُورٌ. Either we are victorious in battle, we defeat them in the battlefield, and we gain honor, we taste the sweetness of victory. وَإِمَّا شَهَادَةٌ. Or we're martyred, and we meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the crown of martyrdom, and we earn eternal life and eternal honor in paradise. فَقَالَ النَّاسُ قَدْ وَاللَّهِ صَدَقَ ابْنُ رَوَاحَةَ. The words of Abdullah ibn Rawaha struck the hearts of the companions, and they were motivated. He had elevated their morale. He lifted their spirits and their morale. And the Muslims moved forward until they arrived in Al-Balqa, which is a village near the village of Musharraf, which is where the Roman army was, where the army of Heraclius, the Roman Empire, had resided. And their army consisted of Romans and Arab Christians. And from there, the Muslims went to another village in the area of Balqa called Mu'ta. And when they arrived in Mu'ta, they encountered the Roman army, and this is basically where the Battle of Mu'ta takes place. This, my dear brothers and sisters, was a detailed prelude to the Battle of Mu'ta. Inshallah, in our next episode, we'll speak about the details of the battle, and we'll speak about the tragic martyrdom of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Zayd ibn Haritha, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha, and we'll speak about their great heroics in the Battle of Mu'tah. And we'll also speak about, inshallah, if time permits, we'll speak about the aftermath of the Battle of Mu'tah and what impact it had on the Muslim community back in Medina. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters, for tuning in once again. And I look forward to having you join us in our upcoming episodes of the life of Prophet Muhammad. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Thank you for the lecture, Sheikh. So, was it common at this time to have this many backup commanders designated?
No, I mean it's the only battle that where the Prophet kind of has all of these contingency plans, and it seems because this is an army that's larger in number than the previous military expeditions. The Prophet was definitely concerned that things could go south very quickly if we don't have strong leadership. So yeah, this was one of those unique circumstances where the Prophet ﷺ had a contingency plan in place in case one commander is killed. So you see these kind of three successive leaders that are put in place. Yeah, it's one of those rare cases where you see the Prophet taking extra precaution, and this really speaks to what was at stake and just the magnitude of the battle itself.
Did Imam Ali not participate in this battle?
So Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib did not participate in this battle. He remained in Medina with the Prophet. Now, again, I haven't found any specific narrations that mention why he did not participate, but I think we can infer from the details that we have. When you have 3,000 people leaving the city, there is a degree of vulnerability, with respect to those who are left behind. So because Medina was potentially vulnerable, even though the Treaty of Hudaybiyya is there, and this is one of the reasons why the Prophet felt justified and safe in sending that many men outside of Medina. When you lose that many men, I think it's also wise for the Prophet from a strategic perspective, and as a matter of taking into consideration the security of Medina, to have someone like Ali ibn Abi Talib, who himself is a one-man army. So I imagine that Rasulullah wanted to keep Ali in Medina because his presence provided security to the residents of Medina. And of course, Allah knows best. That's just my theory.
Could you describe the literal meaning of Ghazwa and the other kind of the battle? I'm forgetting the name. I'm kind of curious about if the meaning might help explain why scholars would still consider this Ghazwa and even the Prophet.
I mean, the linguistic meaning doesn't really give us any insight. So these are just technical terms, very similar to the word salah. So salah has a linguistic meaning, which means dua, but the Islamic tradition kind of gave it a new meaning. Similarly, ghazwa and sariya, these are Arabic words, but in the context of the seerah, they later became technical terms that refer to very specific types of military expedition, right? So sariya comes from the word sayr, which means to move about, to travel, and ghazwa comes from the verb ughzu, which is to kind of depart or to advance. So it doesn't, the linguistic meaning doesn't really give us insight, or it's not obvious it's how it's connected to the technical meaning.
Okay. It seems like the historical or the meaning, this context is more along terms of how significant the battle actually is.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And inshallah, when we speak about the battle itself, um, it's really inspiring to see, the valor and the courage of these men. And inshallah, in our next episode, we'll also speak about the natural, the human emotions that are involved. I mean, yes, you have people who are willing to lay their lives down, but they're still human, right? I mean, when they see the bloodshed and the horrors of battle, that natural human tendency to self-preserve is going to be there. And I think that what makes these personalities so great is not that they were fearless, but they felt fear, but they were able to overcome their fear and make these conscious sacrifice. So I think it's important to always humanize the companions and these figures, because they're much more relatable. If you paint them as these supermen who just felt no fear, you kind of take away that human element. And I think what makes their story so inspiring is that they're human beings like us. They had fear, they had hesitation, and but it's beautiful to kind of see them rise above that and to kind of go through that internal battle and to ultimately overcome those fears and those anxieties and do what was pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
It's a bit surprising to see a generic request for advice from Abdullah bin Rawaha without any context associated with that request for advice. And it seems like some people still practice that today when they see scholars.
Yeah.
Can you talk about it a bit?
Yeah. So Abdullah ibn Rawaha, again, we don't, Abdullah ibn Rawaha, when you look at just the biographical information that we have about him, I mean, this is obviously someone, he's not your typical companion. This is someone who is very concerned about his spiritual development. And again, he doesn't just see the Prophet as a military leader. He's not just a general of the Muslim forces. He sees him as a messenger of God, and there's this yearning for spiritual knowledge. I mean, you have some companions who are like that, who have that type of relationship with the Prophet, who want more, who want to pick the Prophet's brain. You have Abu Dhar, Salman, Ammar, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha again is among those types of personalities. So I think this is a very beautiful practice, that when you're in the presence of great personalities like the Prophet, like the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, is to take advantage of that opportunity to gain knowledge and to gain insight and to better yourself. And I think that again, even though he's going towards the battlefield, he's still thinking about, how can I get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because he sees jihad as ibadah. And this is the right mindset. And the Prophet responds positively to his requests for advice.
Yeah, I think one thing that's kind of stands out in this is it seems like he had some level of faith or belief that the Prophet would have like tailored advice that was what he specifically needed, and some level of like belief in like in the Umm or something.
Yeah. So I mean, I think when you have someone as sophisticated as the Prophet in his spirituality, and who just who sees through the light of God, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not going to give. And I think the Prophet recognized that when Abdullah ibn Rawaha is asking for advice that I can remember, that I can preserve, I think the implication is, Ya Rasulullah, I want you to give me a customized spiritual prescription. So because the Prophet is a physician of the heart and he's a spiritual physician, the Prophet can easily assess and evaluate a person's spiritual status, and the Prophet can give them advice in accordance with their capacity, with their understanding, with their rank, where they are in their journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's really what makes advice coming from the Prophet especially impactful, because it's coming from someone who has mastered the art of spirituality, and just like when you come into the presence of a very learned doctor, there are some doctors, they can look at you and know what your issue is, what your health issue is, and they can prescribe, they can give you medical advice just based off of a brief assessment. The Prophet is like that times a million when it comes to spiritual matters.